What up, Wizards? It's D from SB. Got a chicken with me today, and we are here to talk some weekend spoilers for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Now, this video is going to be a little bit different. We're going to talk about the 3 or 4 cards that have been spoiled so far today on Saturday, and then we're going to switch to an edited version of the VOD from the stream last night where we talked about everything that came out yesterday. Let's start by looking at Bamboo Grove Archer. BGA is 2 mana, 1 and a green for a 3/3 enchantment snake archer with Defender and Reach. You can channel it to pay 4 and a green, discard it to destroy target creature with flying. So a pretty interesting little plummet effect thing going on here, but I'm not sure how good it actually is, especially with the Defender. Without the Defender, it would be an incredible card. With the Defender, I'm not too sure about it. Let's step it up a little bit and look at an uncommon from today that's pretty interesting. This is Banishing Slash. 2 white mana for a sorcery. Destroy up to 1 target artifact, enchantment, or tapped creature. Then, if you control an artifact and an enchantment, create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance. Now, it's going to be hard to... Chicken, you're still here. Hey, it's going to be hard to meet the requirements on this card every time and get your 2/2. And if you do, however, I will say this, if you pay 2 mana, get a 2/2, and blow something up, that seems like a really, really good rate. But it's also cool, the way the card is worded, you destroy up to 1 thing. And then if you control an artifact and enchantment, you get a 2/2. So if there's no target for the card, you're up against control or something like that late game, you can still get a 2/2 for 2 mana out of this. Even if you don't have an artifact or an enchantment out, or both is what I really want you to have, then it's still a 2 mana destroy a wide variety of things, right? You have a lot of options for killing stuff on this card. And even though it's sorcery speed, I kind of like the idea of a couple of copies of this in the sort of mono-white mid-range / control deck that appears to be actually sort of coming together. So it's not a terrible looking card to me. Despite its initials, I don't think it's BS. But let's move on to Naomi. Not that Naomi. It's Naomi Pillar of Order, a new Orzhov legend. At uncommon here, this is 5 mana, 3 a white and a black for a legendary human advisor that's a 4/4. And when it enters the battlefield or attacks, if you control an artifact and an enchantment, create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance. So yet another thing where if you have both of these card types, something really cool happens. And it's not only just on ETBs, it's also on attacks. So this is actually potentially decent, but I have to say that I kind of doubt it in a world where 5 mana gets you so much. I'm not sure this is enough for 5, but if you are able to engineer a situation where you have an artifact and enchantment, you're paying 5 mana for 2 bodies, 6 power, and then as soon as this attacks, you get another dude up, to block. That's a 2/2. And even if you attack with the token that it made when it ETB'd, it's still up to block because it has vigilance. So, I don't know. There's some really cool things about this card, but there's a reason that it's an uncommon. I'm not sure that it's an amazing thing. But if you can enable it, it's probably all right. Seems like more of a signpost uncommon for limited, but I still feel the glow a little bit. It could be an okay card. But let's move on to the last card from today so far, and probably the best one too. And that is Lion Sash. This is 2 mana, 1 and a white for a 1/1 artifact creature equipment cat. You can pay 1 white mana to exile a card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent card, put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each counter on Lion Sash. And it has reconfigure too. I've always wanted to wear a sash. I think I'd look good in a sash, but I've never won anything where I was awarded a sash. So that's sad, but still. This looks okay. Let's talk about the ways in which it is and is not a Scavenging Ooze, because there's a few ways that it's better than a Scavenging Ooze, right? It costs effectively the same amount of mana, just 1 mana, to exile anything from a graveyard just like a Scooze, but Scooze only gets a counter if you exile a creature. This is just any permanent, right? Like you can get a land from a graveyard, a creature, an enchantment, an artifact, a planeswalker, and these will all give your lion +1/+1 counters. So that's really very good. You can do it at instant speed, just like Scooze, to give counters in combat or whatever, in response to burn-based removal. So a lot of cool things about this card, and as far as the things it can hit in a graveyard to get bigger, it's actually better than an Ooze. However, Ooze does gain you life, which is not the most relevant thing that it does. In life gain decks, that matters. But, I don't really care too much about the 1 life on Scooze. It's mostly that Scooze enters the battlefield as a 2/2, whereas Lion only comes in as a 1/1, which is weird because Savannah Lions is a 1 mana 2/1. Lion Sash is a 2 mana 1/1. They're both cats. I don't know. But still, there's some outside things about Lion Sash that might matter, like the fact that it's an artifact creature. Might be good, might actually be quite good in some situations compared to a card like Scooze, right? Like, you can play Lion Sash in an artifact deck and it procs all your artifact synergies. That looks like it might actually matter here. There's a blue-white artifact deck that's sort of coming together that might want a card like this, and this stops a bunch of important strategies in the format, whether it's reanimation or flashback or disturb even, when you see that in the wild sometimes. So, just having a thing that for 1 mana, you can activate it multiple times a turn, add instant speed, can just like eat stuff in the yard is pretty good. We've missed Scavenging Ooze in the few months that we haven't had it in the format. So it's good to have another thing like this. But again, I think the difference between entering play at a 1/1 and entering play at a 2/2 is massive on curve, because one of the cool things about Scooze is that it can trade in the early game with other, 2 and sometimes even 3 drops. And this card's just probably not going to do that on curve while still allowing you to play spells, right? Like, if you want to, you can start eating stuff out of graveyards in the early game if you have a target, which you often don't, but just in case you do. You can eat stuff out of graveyards in the early game, but then you're not playing on curve and stuff. So, same problems as Scooze. The only thing is it's kind of amplified, because this isn't going to trade with anything in the early game, at least, the way a Scooze will. But I think there's one important distinction between the two cards that I think doesn't necessarily put Lion Sash in the lead, but really, really matters, right? Because as the game goes on, Scooze can get bigger. Scavenging Ooze can get to like a 7/7 or whatever some of the time. But your opponent can still point a removal spell at it, or they can just sweep the board, right? But with Lion Sash, you can configure it onto something. You can equip it onto one of your creatures. And then if your opponent hits their Doomscar or some other sweeper later on in the game, then suddenly you get back your Lion Sash, right? Like, you get a creature on the battlefield. Sort of, after they hit their sweeper. So that's kind of important, especially if your Lion Sash is relatively big. Then that's great. So, your opponent might hit a Doomscar, but you still get back like a 5/5 or something like that. And that is actually really big. It's something that Scooze can't do. Sometimes Scavenging Ooze will even be sort of invalidated at some point in the game because there's no more creatures to eat or whatever. Then your opponent can just hit it with a removal spell. But with this, again, you just equip it onto a thing and make your 4/4 into an 8/8. And again, Scooze can't do that. So that's cool. But something else that Scooze can't do is get you blown out when you try to equip it to something. I don't know. I do think the card is really good, and as a replacement for Scavenging Ooze, it does all the same things that a Scavenging Ooze does. So it's going to have a place in the format pretty much no matter what. But now we're going to go to last night's stream to talk about all the cards from yesterday. If you haven't joined the Twitch streams yet, give it a shot. It's free to follow over on Twitch. We do at least one day per spoiler season on Twitch live with all the squad and stuff, and it's fun to talk about it with you guys. But we're going to do a sort of edited version of that VOD now. So I hope you enjoy that, but I'm not going to be able to see you at the end of the video, so I might as well tell you to do the YouTube stuff, check out the Patreon, and of course, most importantly, tell me how you feel about everything down there in the comments section. But I guess just as importantly, make sure that you spread love and you be kind, because I didn't get a chance to tell you that at the end of the last video. My camera cut out on me. But in any case, check out this VOD from the twitch.tv and let me know how you feel about all the stuff we talk about there. But anyway, do that. I'm going to throw it over to past Dev, yesterday Dev. We're going to talk about cards from yesterday. Invoke Calamity? I've been thinking about this card in the 3 hours since it's been spoiled. I've been thinking about this card a lot. I love that the Invoke thing is going to be a cycle. This is 5 mana, 4 red, and 1 of any color. For an oh, this is an instant. Excuse me. The other one is a sorcery. I thought it was a cycle of sorceries until just now. See, I learn things sometimes on stream. But anyway, instant speed. You may cast up to 2 instant and or sorcery spells with total mana value 6 or less from your graveyard and or hand without paying their mana costs. If those spells would be put into your graveyard, exile them instead. Exile Invoke Calamity. So this card actually looks kind of very... So I love that you can cast this at instant speed. It's kind of amazing. You can just like hit this during your opponent's combat step or like EOT. That seems really good. Instant speed makes this much better than I thought it was, and I already thought it was kind of okay. I thought it was good in 2 roles. One, as sort of a burn decks, now I have 5 mana, I just win the game, right? Sort of a piece of reach for burn decks, right? Like, oh, I'm out of cards in my hand, but now I can just recast the 2 bolts out of my graveyard with 2 bolt-like effects. Like in Standard, you recast 2 Royal Eruptions or something. Or you just hit for 5 with a Royal Eruption to play with fire, right? You just end the game that way. And that would be good enough. But you could also cast sort of difficult to cast spells with this, right? Like 3 and 4 color, 5 color spells, you know, like let's say that there's a spell that costs 1 of each color. And like even it could cost 1 of each color and 1 other mana, right? Because you can get 6 or less here. So you could cast like a Storm the Festival or something out of your graveyard with this, or even out of your hand, depending on like how your mana looked. So you could make a deck that's like mostly red, right? But it can dump, you know, it uses maybe Tormenting Voice style effects, right? We have like Cathartic Pyre and Unexpected Windfall, instant Seize the Spoils. You know, there's any number of ways to discard like huge, difficult to cast spells, and then later on you just Invoke Calamity and cast them out of your yard. Like, it could work, you know. The fact that it's an instant makes it playable in sort of a blue-red deck that's heavy on the red, to allow it to cast, you know, counter spells out of its graveyard. That's kind of interesting. But again, you have to have tons of red mana. But I guess playing like a Goldspan Dragon would make it easier to get double red. This is just sacrifice 2 treasures to get the 4 red on this. So you could easily cast, you know, Saw It Coming at instant speed out of your yard and a removal spell, you know, and that might be really fantastic. But I'm not sure the blue-red has spots for this, although it just got, you know, 8 spots it has to fill. So maybe something like this could go in, you know, a more traditional Is It Dragons deck. Although I don't know how great it's going to be there, how many copies you'd actually play. So I think that this is probably most playable in a burn deck, and at the moment there's not really a burn deck in Standard, so I'm not too sure about it. Let's move on. Let's move on to an uncommon that I actually dig, man. I think this card's really good. Twin Shot Sniper is a fixed Bone Crusher Giant, right? This is 4 mana, 3 in a red for a 2/3 artifact creature, Goblin Archer, with reach. And when it ETBs, it deals 2 damage to any target. You can also channel it, pay 1 in a red, and discard it to have it deal 2 damage to any target. This is actually really sick for a number of reasons. Just on turn 2, discard it, 2 damage to a target. Actually really good. It's actually not too bad. It's a removal spell on a body. Those are almost always going to be good. But if you wait until you have 4 mana, it's still a removal spell on a body. You know, it's going to take out like a 2 toughness thing, and your opponent probably has one of those. But even if they don't have a target for it, you just dome them. That's pretty good too. You know, it's got a couple of somewhat decent creature types. Both Artifact and Goblin are probably somewhat relevant in this environment. I just think this is a really primo uncommon, man. I really do. I think that it's no Bone Crusher Giant, but even like a not as good Bone Crusher is still like a really, really good card. And when you do choose to cast it, it still gives you the shock anyway. That's so good. Like, I like this card a lot. I'm not sure where it really fits in Standard. Again, maybe we're seeing the nuts and bolts of like a Standard burn deck somewhere. It is interesting this doesn't work with Invoke Calamity, right? Like, you can't channel this and then play it out of your yard with Invoke Calamity. So a little bit of synergy missing there, but still, this is... it's no Flame Tongue Kavu, right? It's a 4 mana red creature that always snipes something and has like 4 power. It's not Flame Tongue Kavu, but... Flame Tongue, you can't discard Flame Tongue Kavu at instant speed and kill something, right? You can with this. It's also uncounterable. That's the cool thing about Channel, is that they can't like saw it coming your, you know, final bolt spell or your final shock to kill them or in the game. I do think this is probably a card worth playing in certain mid-range piles and stuff. And especially maybe even in goblins and whatnot. I think it's a fine card. But moving on to Lizard Blades. I don't know why this card is rare, but I do think this card is good. I do not think this is a bad Magic card. I just don't think it should have been rare. Double Dragon here, which is just what the artwork reminds me of, is a 2 mana, 1 in a red for a 1/1 lizard. Equipment Lizard. It's an artifact creature with double strike. Equipped creature has double strike, and you can reconfigure this for 2. This actually does look pretty good. You know, 2 mana, 1/1 double strikers have been getting better and better as time has gone on, and this looks like one of the better ones ever. you know. You can either load this up with equipments or auras or whatever, and that's good. And in draft, this is going to be pretty decent because, you know, you want to modify creatures, and this is a really good creature to modify, right? Just in and of itself. But if it's not looking good, you know, if you can't really get in with your 1/1 double striker, then just for 2 mana, that's really not too much to ask. Just for 2 mana, you can reconfigure this, slap it onto your 3/3 or whatever, and suddenly you got a really potent attacker. So I like this a good bit. You know, it's like a fencing ace or something that when it becomes invalidated, you can just throw it on something else. Or, you know, there's kind of a push-pull where, do I put auras on this, the actual, you know, equipment itself? Do I put auras on this and attack with it? Or do I load up a different creature with auras and then equip this to that creature to give it double strike? So, I don't know. There's some really cool, like, play patterns with this that I can imagine. And I think the card is cool, but does it go anywhere? Red-white warriors. Right? The only problem is it's not a warrior, so that's kind of weird. But the age-old question with the red-white equipments deck, and it's usually a warrior deck, the age-old problem with that is how many equipments do you play and how many creatures do you play? Because there's a push-pull, right? There's a balance between those two things. You don't want to draw too many of one and not enough of the other or whatever. And cards like this allow you to play both a creature and an equipment in the same slot. And I think that's really, really important for decks like that. So, cool card, and might even see some very, very fringe play in exactly one deck. But it's a cool card. But moving on to Thousand-Faced Shadow. This is a card actually from yesterday that I didn't get to yesterday. This is probably just a really pivotal, just important, critical piece for the ninja decks in the format. This is just 1 blue mana for a 1/1 human ninja with ninjutsu 2 and 2 blue. It has flying. When it enters the battlefield from your hand, if it's attacking, create a token that's a copy of another target attacking creature. The token enters the battlefield tapped and attacking. So this is really, really cool, right? Like, you can play this as just a 1 mana 1/1 flyer and have an evasive 1-drop, and that'll allow you to do ninjutsu stuff on turn 2, turn 3, whatever. So again, just critical piece for those decks in that way. But if you hold it till later on in the game, you can create a token of something really important. Maybe, you know, create a token of Master Splinter because he's not legendary, and just give, you know, another anthem effect to all of your ninjas on the table. Add instant speed with the ninjutsu. So there's probably a lot of really cool things to do with this, and I imagine it's an automatic 4 of in ninja decks. And it actually looks like a pretty good piece for those decks too. So I like Thousand-Faced Shadow a lot. Let's move on to Kodama of the West Tree. They finished the cycle. Everyone was right. You're all very smart, each and every one of you. Kodama of the West Tree is the cycle that they're finishing in this set. This is 3 mana, 2 and a green for a 3/3 legendary spirit with reach. Modified creatures you control have trample. Whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Is this card good? It's probably a good card in a format that has Luminarch Aspirant and a number of other, you know, things that can come into play with a +1/+1 counter, you know, on turn 2 or whatever. But I don't know if we have that critical mass of things that come into play with a +1/+1 counter on 2, or even 1. I don't know how many things we have on 1 that come into play with a +1/+1 counter. In terms of Luminarch Aspirant, if you can go Aspirant into this, it's probably decent, but, you know, by turn 3, especially on the draw, I'm not sure that you're going to get in with a profitable attack with that Luminarch Aspirant, like, even if you hit the correct start. The problem also is, in terms of, like, how deck building works a lot of the time, is this is a card that ramps. It wants you to play, first of all, a lot of basic lands. So you can't play too many colors in your deck, because that'll cause you to play too many non-basic lands. You're only playing like 3 or 4 basic lands. This card isn't as good, right? So you want to play this in a 1 or 2 color deck that has a number of basic lands in it. So there's that. But this card also, because it's a ramp card, wants you to play like 6, 7, 8 mana cards to pay this off, right? However, you also have to play like 2-drops that work with this and 1-drops that work with this. And like, how do you build that deck? You know, like, how many 1-drops does it play? Probably 0. How many 2-drops does it play? Probably 8 to 10. Is that enough to profitably get to proc this on turn 3 every time? You know, it's not modified itself, so you have to play things that modify it. That's again where Luminarch Aspirant comes in, because Luminarch Aspirant puts a counter on this. It's 4/4 reach, trample. That can probably get you some ramp, right? But then what are you going to cast with that ramp? I'm not too sure about this one. But we'll move on to Ao. Ao of the Dawn Sky. This is 5 mana, 3 and 2 white for a 5/4 legendary dragon spirit with flying and vigilance. When it dies, choose 1. Look at the top 7 cards of your library. Put any number of non-land permanent cards with total mana value 4 or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on each permanent you control that's a creature or a vehicle is the other mode on this. So these are both really interesting modes. If you're behind and you don't have a lot of creatures, this will replace itself with possibly like 2 guys, you know, which is interesting. And it doesn't even have to replace itself with creatures. It can replace itself with enchantments or artifacts or vehicles. You know, it can do that. However, if you do already have permanents on the battlefield and this dies, suddenly all your creatures get way bigger if that's the mode that you want to choose. You know, if you've got like 3 other dudes on the battlefield, your opponent kind of can't kill this because it's going to replace itself with more power than it had in the first place. And not only that, but a 5/4 flying vigilance is probably halfway decent in most board states. You know, a flying vigilance fatty is always tough. A Sarah Angel is always tougher to deal with than you think it is. And if anything, this is a strictly better Sarah Angel. Well, I guess not strictly because it's legendary. But, you know, it's mostly a strictly better Sarah Angel, right? So I think this is kind of cool. Let's keep it rolling with Jin-Gitaxias, the Midnight Sky. I think this may have gotten previewed today. Like even on Mythic Spoiler, where they sometimes won't tell you about things that got previewed. But Jin-Gitaxias is 5 mana. This is 3 and 2 black for a 5/5 legendary dragon spirit with flying and menace. When Jin-Gitaxias, the Midnight Sky dies, choose 1. Each opponent discards 2 cards and loses 2 life. Or put target non-dragon creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. You lose 2 life. If your opponent does use a removal spell on it, it kind of has ward. They discard 2 cards. I imagine most of the time if your opponent uses a removal spell on this, it's just going to end up obliterating their hand. This is how I would imagine this works. And they don't want that. They probably don't want that. But that's probably how it's going to work a lot of the time. Now, if the opponent doesn't have too many cards in their hand, or if you just have like a really juicy thing in your graveyard, then, you know, suddenly you just reanimate something. Like, note that there's no real restriction on like the casting cost of the thing. Like, if there's a Hullbreaker Horror in your graveyard, you get to reanimate it with this when it dies. So that might be important in sort of a blue-black reanimator build of some kind, you know. Like, this is a reanimator spell. It's a 5 mana, 5/5 flying menace reanimator spell. And I don't know about you guys, but, you know, I played Unbreakable Bond. I've played a number of 5 mana reanimation spells in these last couple of years, and this is basically that, but you have to wait till it dies. However, if it doesn't die, it just kills your opponent. That's fine too, right? So, like, maybe this is really good. I think that some of the board states, like some of the possible scenarios this puts an opponent in, are really, really awkward. So this card might be a little better than it might look at first glance. We'll move on to Fox McCloud. It even kind of, if you look at it sideways, it kind of looks like Fox. Hotshot Mechanic is 1 white mana for a 2/1 artifact creature Fox pilot. And it can crew vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. That's sick. This card is disgusting, isn't it? Like, as far as best Savannah Lion ever printed, I think it's probably still Usher. Usher probably just barely beats this card out. But the fact that your 1-drop can crew 4 is disgusting. But what I think is maybe worth even more than that, is the fact that this is an artifact creature. This is a Savannah Lions for decks that want artifacts. And they don't really have a lot of those. You know, like, does Affinity play this card? In Standard, the fact that this crews in a Seek's Chariot, probably important, right? But, geez, dude, an artifact creature Savannah Lions is going to be incredibly important. You know, like, yikes. I don't know, man. This is going to work out in a lot of decks that care about artifacts and stuff. You know, imagine I have an Ingenious Smith in play. I can play a Hotshot Mechanic and Ingenious Smith procs. Like, that's kind of sex. This is just standard, by the way. The truly busted stuff you're going to be able to do with this is going to be in Modern and Legacy, I would imagine. Where there's plenty of artifact-centric decks that would love this. Like, so, I don't know, man. I think this is going to be an incredibly important card. Definitely top tier, busted up smash, ridiculous card. But let's look next at Tatsunari, Toad Rider. This is really cool art. I love a lot of the anime art, and I do love, too, especially in the anime art, the color palette. These, like, pinkish purples, these light blues, they splash yellow in there. It's definitely part of the color palette for the set. I think it's gorgeous, but anyway, Tatsunari Toad Rider is my new best friend. It's just such a cool card. 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 3/3 legendary human ninja. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, if you don't control a creature named Kimi, create Kimi, a legendary 3/3 black and green frog creature token with whenever you cast an enchantment spell, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain life, or 1 life. You can also pay 1 and then a hybrid Simic to have Toad Rider and target frog you control not be able to be blocked this turn except by creatures with flying or reach. So what this is 3 mana for 6 power and stats. Now, you have to have an enchantment in your hand, and you have to devote mana to playing that enchantment, right? However, that enchantment doesn't have to resolve. It's just whenever you cast an enchantment spell. So, on turn 3, you get your 3/3. On turn 4, cast an enchantment and get a free 3/3. That is actually stupid. That's actually seems pretty good, you know? Like, on turn 4, if I cast my Hallowed Haunting, right? Usually, I'm taking... This is why this card is so good. Usually, 4 mana, do-nothing enchantments, right, are very bad. Really bad. So this makes it to where on curve, you can go turn 3 this, turn 4, do-nothing enchantment, get a free 3/3 that also has like a weird blood artistry whenever you cast an enchantment spell sort of value on it. But there's even more value on it. It just allows you for 2 mana to get in for 6 damage. Effectively, right? So I think this card is actually kind of good, kind of really good in a lot of situations. And you don't even have to be playing in a super heavy enchantment deck. You know, you could just be playing something like, Precipitous Drop, the Venture into the Dungeon removal spell, something like that. You could be playing a black-white deck that plays, you know, Oblivion Ring style effects or Containment Circle and stuff like that. Would work really well with this. Like, imagine you play this on turn 3. And then turn 4, you know, Oblivion Ring. Whatever the 3 mana Oblivion Ring is. I always forget what it's called in Standard right now. But yeah, I think there's multiple of them. But yeah, just turn 3, you play this. Turn 4, you Oblivion Ring your opponent's biggest creature or planeswalker or whatever. And you get another 3/3. Just seems sick to me. I think this card is actually, like, slyly kind of really good. And I love the flavor. I do. You pay the 2 mana, and, like, he hops on the back of the toad, and they, like, jump into the air. They can't be blocked. It's very cute. It's very cute. But just, I don't know. I really like this card. I think it's super, possibly, potentially very good, but very likely not. It's probably more in, like, it's like a 7, 7 out of 10, you know, but I don't know, it could see some real play. I think this is a decent card. I really do. Up next is Moonsnare Prototype. Just 1 blue mana for an artifact. You can tap it to tap an untapped artifact or creature you control and add a colorless mana. Now you can also channel and pay 4 and a blue and discard Prototype. The owner of target non-land permanent puts it on the top or bottom of their library. They always choose top. But it's still good, and you can still do this at instant speed. And the last few sets, the going rate for this at instant speed, this channel ability, has been 5 mana. So you're not really losing anything, right? Usually this effect costs 5. If you rip it in the late game, suddenly it's kind of a removal spell, tempo kind of thing. And honestly, in case you've never experienced it, a creature going back on top, or really non-land permanent, it can be anything in this case, a planeswalker, going back on top of your library, actually kind of a feel bad. It kind of doesn't feel great to replace your draw step, right? Because usually you're looking to draw a specific card to negate something you already have. So, but it's always really annoying. But the important thing about this card is that it's a 1 mana thing that taps for mana. right? In kind of a Jaspera Sentinel sort of way. The good thing about this, there's two comparisons to Sentinel, right? The good comparison to Sentinel is that it's an artifact, and so it can't be shocked, right? It can't be like killed as easily as a Jaspera Sentinel. It can't be board wiped away, right? However, Jaspera Sentinel produces any color mana, which is key. This just produces colorless mana. However, it is still a 1-drop artifact that taps to produce mana, so this is a good Magic card. It is, you know, it can't do so on the turn it enters the battlefield, or at least it can. That's another thing about Jaspera Sentinel. Jaspera Sentinel has summoning sickness. This doesn't, so that's important. But, you know, it can't tap for mana on turn 1, is what I meant to say. But it doesn't necessarily have to, right? All you have to do is play, you know, a 1-drop creature on turn 2, and then suddenly you have, you know, a land untapped still, and you have this. You can play a 2-drop. There's probably going to be some really important starts with this card, and this is another just really good 1-drop artifact. You know, imagine with like Blackstaff of Waterdeep, for instance. You play this on 1, you play Blackstaff on 2, you still have a mana up, so you can play a 2-drop by tapping this and the Blackstaff. And then on the next turn, you can just use Blackstaff to turn this into a 4/4, you know? Like, there are some really good lines with this card in Standard right now, and I imagine there's probably some good lines even in, like, Historic and Pioneer and Modern, because a 1-drop artifact that taps for mana is potentially very, very good. Also, maybe potentially a decent card in Pauper. I just want to throw that out there. Yeah, kind of a Springleaf Drum in some ways. It is almost exactly a Springleaf Drum in a lot of ways. I just think this is a really sweet card that if you don't draw it early, but you do draw it late, it just becomes kind of a removal spell. Very versatile card. Can do a lot in the early game, but it can do something in the late game too. And I really like that about it.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck techs. I come correct like a porn star, slicing up all these other suckers with my sword mark.